Hey guys, it's Luke Johnson from Noetic, the humanities teaching app. And today I'm joined again by Robert Schut, and we are going to talk about the third discourse in the three Upbuilding Discourses of 1844. And this one is entitled, He Must Increase, I Must Decrease. And it's based off of John chapter 3, verses 29 through 30. Before we get into it, maybe just we should talk about some of our initial perceptions of the text. Robert, I'll have to say, this one was a little bit more difficult for me. I found it to be maybe, personally, this is just my opinion, I found it maybe to be stylistically clunky for Kierkegaard. I read it twice, and I'm not really sure it became that much better stylistically. I mean, I think there are really interesting points here, but as far as Kierkegaard goes, I would say he's executed his aesthetic writing style better in other places. I don't know. Did you struggle with this one at all, or is that just me?
Well, in the beginning, in the opening, when he talks about the rising sun and the setting sun, as we'll talk about in a minute, it was a little difficult to try to figure out what is he getting at here. I mean, there's other times in his works where he kind of works around the issue, and you never know where he's going with this until you get really near the end, but then you have to go back again and reread it with that new information in mind. And then it makes a little bit more sense the next time you read it, like you were saying. I think that this depends a little bit more on your biblical knowledge of John the Baptist here, as we'll talk about as well. So maybe when we put some of the other pieces in, you might see where else you might see it making more sense in those areas. So we could do that.
Yeah, and I think actually I'm sort of anticipating, like, I think maybe the point that Kierkegaard wants to get across in this discourse might be actually pretty easily communicated. I could be wrong. I'm sort of anticipating that we're going to have a pretty detailed discussion about who John the Baptist was. Actually, that's where my philosophical intrigue goes to. I never thought about John the Baptist seriously. He was always kind of a figure that I absorbed passively in kind of my Methodist rural church upbringing, and I never really thought about his status very much. And I think this discourse raises a lot of questions about his existential status within the arc of Christianity. But I'm not sure that Kierkegaard wanted to bring that much attention to him, but to me, that was the thing that left me most intrigued about this discourse.
Yeah, I think Kierkegaard picks up on something, which is a little bit of an obscure point about him that most people, when they study him, like in Sunday school as children, or even as adults, they don't see this particular point of his life, of John the Baptist's life. So I think it'll be interesting to explore this for us and hopefully for the audience as well.
All right, cool. So let's just get into it. This discourse starts off with kind of a mishmash of metaphors, but the general saying is going to be the thing that begins and ends the discourse. So I think that's the thing that we need to focus on. And the expression is along the lines of, everyone would rather see the sun rise than set. And that generally everybody sort of agrees to this, but not really has some comprehension of it. Now, I don't know if that's true. I've never really heard that idiomatic expression. Maybe it was more common in the 19th century. Maybe people were always like, oh, sunrises are better than sunsets. I don't know. I mean, so I thought that was kind of interesting to begin with, that he takes this idiomatic expression about the sun rising versus the sun setting as being sort of this thing that everybody universally assents to. I personally like sunsets a lot. But so I struggled at first to try to get at what he was trying to say here, because he brings in some other metaphors, like how, the divine knowledge is introspection, and if the sun falls on a sundial and you look, you can tell what the accurate time is. And I'm just like, Kierkegaard, you're trying to do too much here in 2 or 3 paragraphs. And you get I don't know. I thought it was a little bit confusing. So I kind of put all that away and kind of tried to focus a little bit more on this, why the sun rising is better than the sun setting. And he gives us like a little bit of a clue here. He says that really the essence of that expression can only be understood in this context. He says, only when the words are said by the right person in the right situation in the right way, only then has the saying done everything it can to guide the single individual to do honestly what one otherwise is quick enough to do, to refer everything to oneself. And I guess Kierkegaard believes that he's going to be the guide, to be that right person in the right scenario, to kind of give us an idea of what it means to appreciate the sunrise versus the sunset. And this is going to involve John the Baptist, right? Apparently John the Baptist is the one who said these words. Do I have this right? That did John the Baptist originate these words? He must increase, I must decrease.
Yes, he did.
Yeah. So, now, and so this is kind of a silly question. The book, I don't have the theological training that Robert has. That comes from the book of John, but John the Baptist is not the same person as who wrote the book of John, right?
That's correct. Yeah, John the Baptist. Do you want a little background? Should we do a little background right now?
Yeah. I think we need to do a lot of background on John the Baptist.
Okay. Well, what we know.
I was going to let you do that.
Okay. Well, we don't know a lot about John the Baptist, but interestingly, Josephus, the historian, he was a Jew who became a Roman historian. He wrote the history of the Jews. He actually writes a little bit about John the Baptist as being, a prophet. So we have we have confirmation that there was a guy called John the Baptist. So Kierkegaard calls him John the Baptizer.
Oh, yes, right.
We call him John the Baptist. He was out. The relationship between him and Jesus is interesting. In the early part of, I think it was in Luke, Mary goes to visit her relative, and it's not specific as to who Elizabeth is, a cousin, a sister-in-law, or whatever, we don't know, but Elizabeth is a relative of Mary. And it turns out that Elizabeth is with a child, she's pregnant. And this child becomes John the Baptist. So we know that there's some kind of a familiar relationship between John the Baptist and Jesus. Cousins, or first or second cousins maybe, or cousins-in-law, or whatever term, but there's some connection. Yeah.
And his birth is miraculous in a way, is it not? John the Baptizer's birth. Because his mother was very advanced in age, was she not?
I'm not sure that she was advanced in age. If it says that,
that's what Kierkegaard says. He says the difference between John the Baptizer and Jesus is that John the Baptizer, his mother was very old. Postmenopausal, or whatever, and whereas Jesus's mother Jesus was a virgin birth, and that in some way this can kind of help us understand the relationship between the two of them. And that's what I got of my little bit of research, is that generally John the Baptizer's mother is considered to be pretty old, but
okay, I'd have to reread that part. I'm not sure, but if you said you've read that somewhere else, I'll confirm it then. And then it doesn't say anything that they knew each other as children or grew up as children, but maybe we can assume that a little bit if they were close enough geographically. But the encounter is when John is baptizing. This is his mission. He feels he's been called to go out and baptize people for the coming of the Messiah. So he's got this general idea the Messiah is going to come, and he's the one that's coming from Isaiah, I believe, that he's the one who's supposed to go out, prepare the way of Yahweh, prepare the way of the Lord. And so he goes out, he lives out in the desert, in the wilderness, eats locusts and has a belt made out of, I think it was hair.
Camel hair.
Yeah, and so he lives this kind of obscure life. And then all of a sudden, Jesus shows up. And he knows this is the guy I've been waiting for. This is the Messiah. Although he doesn't exactly say that, he knows that this man is the one that he's been waiting for. His mission was pointing for this man to come.
How does he know it? Does he just like look at Jesus and he's like, oh yeah, that's the Messiah? Because this is where the story kind of gets interesting, is once he baptizes him, something happens.
Yeah, he says, upon whomever the Spirit descends and remains, he's the one. If I remember correctly, that was how John would know it. And apparently he saw, I don't know whether it was a vision he had. I mean, we all see in the paintings and that, we see a dove landing on the head of Jesus, and that's it. Whether it was that literal, I don't know. But whatever it was, John saw something in Jesus that remained upon him during the baptism. Now, it may be that like I said, that maybe John the Baptist heard about Jesus, and he heard some of the things that he said. There may have been more. I mean, we're only looking at a very abbreviated gospel of what happened, of the big events, when they came together at this point. Did they ever come together at other points? It's certainly possible. So there may have been more of that John knew of Jesus than just this one meeting. But that's all we've got to go by factually, historically. So he sees it.
Yeah, what's interesting, just to tie into the background information that you're giving us, is that not unlike how other events in the New Testament can be sort of documented in different ways. From my little bit of research of John the Baptist and the encounter with Christ, after Jesus is baptized, there is this announcement from heaven that he is my, the chosen one or whatever, and the dove descends, or a dove breaks free, and the Spirit descends or whatever.
Right.
It seems like that the detail of those events varies from gospel to gospel, whereas one gospel will talk about this being something that only Jesus could perceive. Only Jesus could hear the voice from heaven. And then in another gospel, it's much more public. It's not as private. And everyone, including John the Baptist, could hear this announcement from heaven that this is, oh, hey, this is my son, by the way. I don't know if you have an opinion on that.
Yeah, there's from different viewpoints. And, when we see things from different viewpoints, sometimes we just see different things. It depends upon what they're focusing on. Also, the way that the New Testament is written, it's based upon what the writer wanted to focus upon. So certain writers have left out certain information because they didn't feel it was necessary, while other writers included it because they felt it was necessary. But they don't necessarily contradict one another. They're just giving us a little different viewpoint of that situation. Yeah. So, but you're absolutely right. There was a time when the certain things were said, and that happened again also at the Transfiguration when they heard a voice from heaven speaking to them. Could it have been like thunder that was interpreted to be the voice of God? We don't know that. It's probably getting a little too specific there. But then
what happens to John the Baptist?
What happens to him, that was with the dance with Salome. Remember, John the Baptist was saying things about the marriage between Herod and Salome's mother, because Salome's mother was actually she married Herod's brother, and Herod went and kind of stole her away from his brother and married her. And that was forbidden under Jewish law, to marry your husband's wife. So she was an adulteress, and so was he, I guess. And so John the Baptist was saying this about her, preaching this, and it made her very uncomfortable. Herod was kind of afraid of John the Baptist a little bit, and curious, probably a little fear and curious. Who is this guy? What can I do? I better not do too much because the people think he's a prophet, and if I execute him, it's not going to make me sit too well with my Jewish friends, because he actually was arguably, was he Jewish or not? There's a big theological controversy between.
Right, I'm going to get at that. Yeah.
Yeah, he did kind of. I believe him and his family were circumcised, but it was something they did out of political force. They had to do this. I think he was a Edomite, and it had to do with the historical occupation of Edom by the Jews, and they kind of forced everybody to get circumcised. So, was he a Jew or not? It's hard to tell for sure, but he was afraid of his political position in Jerusalem. And so the story goes, one evening, Salome, his very attractive daughter, it wasn't his daughter, it was his stepdaughter. And he wanted her to perform a dance, and he said, I'll give you anything up to the half of my kingdom. And so she danced. And after the dance, he said, okay, what do you want? And he said, I want the head of John the Baptist on a silver platter. And he was pretty shocked by that because he wasn't planning on the execution. But he gave his word in front of all the other people that were there, and he's the king. He can't break his word. So he had John the Baptist executed. Prior to that, he had him arrested, put in a jail, and then he had him executed. So that's what became of John the Baptist. He was eventually decapitated.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that from what I was able to decipher from the research that I did, is that this word of John the Baptizer's beheading got back to Jesus and the disciples. That they did learn about what Herod had done. Now, the thing that was very interesting to me, and I'm sure it will come up again towards the end of our conversation about the discourse here, is how we are, and you sort of hinted and alluded to the ambiguity of John the Baptist, is trying to understand who John the Baptist is. Because he's a New Testament figure, but he seems to be an Old Testament prophet, and he seems to acknowledge something special about Jesus, but I don't know if Jesus had done enough at this point in the Gospels for John to Christianly believe in Jesus, so that John was himself a Christian, because he was contemporaneous with Jesus. Mm-hmm. But he died before the crucifixion and the resurrection. So, who was John the Baptist? Was he like the last Jewish prophet? Was he one of the first Christians? Or what do you make of his status? Because later on in the discourse, and maybe I should just say something to this effect, is that Kierkegaard says that John the Baptist was the friend of the bridegroom. Yeah. And that he was shut out, right? And that you and I, because of our connection to Christ, can actually bask in the glory of the kingdom of heaven, whereas John the Baptizer didn't have that available to him. And Kierkegaard and the Bible says something to the effect of John the Baptist was the greatest man ever. Right. And yet we are in a better position than him. So I guess I'm trying to figure out here, how was John the Baptist one of the greatest men that ever lived? Why was he shut out? If he knew who Christ was, why wasn't he a Christian? Can you answer any of those questions? I will try. Yeah. John the Baptist lived under the law, and he was called a prophet because he was under the law still. Christ had not yet fulfilled the law. Okay? So everything that John did was under the law, under the legal system.
he was still under that symbolic system where the offerings, the lambs that were offered, was still symbolic of the Messiah yet to come, or of some ultimate execution whereby sins would be forgiven. And this is what John knew. John knew the shadows of what were to come. He didn't see the actual reality of the Messiah yet. But what he saw were the shadows, and what he was talking about to the Jews were the shadows, which were a prediction of what was to come. So John, it was not shut out in the sense where God said, I'm not going to let you come in. But he was shut out in the sense that he didn't have available to him the experience, or the actual experience of the Messiah and what the Messiah would do. That's why even at the end, if you notice, he sends a messenger. While he's in prison, he sends a messenger to Jesus, and he said, are you the one who is to come, or is there another to come after you? So John didn't really know for sure. And then Jesus responds to him, and he says, tell them that the blind can see, the lame can walk. I think it was forgiveness is preached unto the world, or I can't remember the final thing he said. But yeah, there were, I think, 3 things that he said to John that confirmed to John that he was, in fact, the Messiah.
So that's what Kierkegaard alludes to when he talks about the emissaries that were perhaps tempting John, but he doesn't give in to them.
Perhaps. I'm not really sure that was the connection. I didn't read it in that light, but I'd have to go back over that again. So John had, only thing he had at his disposal was the law, and like I say, and the foreshadows. So it was up until that moment, that was the transition period. That's why Jesus says, unto all men that are born of women, there's none greater than John the Baptist. But even you know, you who are born after, you who can believe in the resurrection, you are greater than this man. Because Jesus' ministry had not yet started, really, until just about the time that John was, during the execution, his ministry just got started.
Right.
So, and certainly the kingdom of heaven wasn't fully preached or fully understood at that time. Jesus was still, in a sense, under the law. It gets to be a little difficult to explain at that point. You have to take it at moments in time. But Jesus was becoming the Messiah at that time. And it wasn't until the crucifixion and the resurrection that Jesus becomes the king of heaven. So up until that time, John was still the last prophet to speak.
So did the disciples not become Christians until the resurrection?
Well, asking for
I'm putting you on something.
No, I understand. These are, we're trying to look for discrete moments. You know, I'm not sure that everybody has a discrete moment, even in our own lives. When did we actually become a Christian? Was it at our conversion, our baptism, first communion? You know, what moment is it? I don't know if we can create such a graphic line in the sand and say, okay, now that you've stepped over on this side, you're a Christian. A Christian, remember, really didn't come about immediately.
Right.
The term Christian was only given to them later on when they started to call themselves Christians. And even then, the early church, I don't know how much they adopted that term. It became more popular later on. So I don't think that there were discrete moments, but it wasn't until there was a discrete moment, at least in the kingdom, is when Jesus resurrected. Resurrected, and you might say, and the ascension also played a role in it, is when the kingdom of heaven came into being and was fulfilled.
They probably didn't think of themselves as discontinuous from the Jewish tradition that they were participants in.
Correct. Right. They thought of themselves as Jews who are entering into this fulfillment. The Messiah has come, and their Judaism was complete. So that's how they thought of themselves early, especially of James's church. That's a whole other topic, but in James's church, they really thought of themselves as Jews, still kind of quasi under the law, but yet believing in Jesus. So there was a period of time of transition, so it wasn't that clear, bright line between one and the other. You know?
So the final question, and then we'll move on to the Kierkegaard stuff, is I'm just kind of curious why we are to think of John the Baptist as, I can understand how he would still be under the law and would be not unlike other Old Testament prophets, not unlike an Abraham or a Moses or some, but and maybe this is just poetical flourish, but why is he called like the greatest? Just because he's the last, or?
I think that I would have to answer you with my understanding of that. Somebody else might have a different one. My understanding is I think he was the greatest because he saw the Messiah. He got to announce the Messiah and said, this is the Messiah. He's coming. Here he is. And no other prophet did that. Every other prophet had to talk from a very distant future, but John the Baptist came right up to that moment. And I think that's why John was the greatest prophet. Not that he was a better person than Isaiah. I don't think it was better in the sense of character. I think it was just better in the sense of opportunity and mission. John had the mission of introducing God on earth. So this is the greatest prophet. That's how I see that.
It was the opening. Well, this is great. I know like some people are going to be like, oh, this is such a, but to be honest, I mean, it's just one of those things that I think we take for granted in our sort of our understanding of Christianity, like where upon further examination, it gets very, very muddied. But I think you did a great job answering a lot of my questions. I mean, I found this to be very educational. I can't imagine someone else wouldn't find what you just. So back to the Kierkegaard, to deal with this general expression that started the whole discourse off of preferring the sunrise to the sunset. John, he says this on page 277 about John the Baptizer. Then rose the sun of him whose morning star aroused the wonder of the wise men. Its glory shone, and no one understood better than John that its rising was the setting of his sun. So, like, John is going to John's whole life is dedicated in the Messiah. So you can understand why he would be very celebratory, rejoice that as his own star diminishes, his whole life task comes to fruition with the ushering in of Jesus. And you can see why he would say, he must increase, I must decrease. Like John's celebrity has to give way to the Son of God. And I think that's I guess a kind of a concept that maybe we all sort of understand, that like, just like I might think like right now I'm hitting a stride, but maybe someone will supplant me and whatever I do, be it music or this endeavor or whatever the next thing is. But usually there's some pain and ennui and depression and agony or whatever that goes along with that. And John's case seems to be very particular. And it says that he can rejoice about being supplanted because like everything's been destined for this particular moment. And I don't know. I think the big takeaway, and I'm going to, I think the big takeaway is that it seems like what Kierkegaard is trying to say in this discourse is that we can all sort of experience that joy and glory if we view ourselves as sort of an instrument for God. That if we sort of use ourselves for the glorification of God, we too can take some sort of celebratory aspect of our lives home if we see that we're merely being used by a grander power. Something to that effect. There, and he says on page 285, let's, to to say this about John the Baptizer and how it can relate to our own maybe more minor mirroring of it. He says, but humble self-denial remains true to itself and continues in harmony with the one who ought to increase, even though he himself must decrease, as did John, since with that witness his son went down, and yet when was he greater than he was at that moment? But as a result, he too increased and was greatest when he went down. And I guess the idea here is being like when we can become sort of the instrument of God and brought into harmony with God. There's this passage that I looked up earlier today where it talks about us being God's building in God's field. I took a snapshot of it and I'll share it if I can pull it up fast enough. This is from 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 9. And it says, for we are co-workers in God's service. You are God's field, God's building. And maybe that's how we can deal with the idea of the sun rising being better than the sun setting, that we don't have to necessarily moan about the fact that we are going away and there's some sort of greatness because we're brought in harmony with God. What do you think about what I'm saying here so far? Do you think I have a decent enough handle on what Kierkegaard's trying to convey?
Yeah, exactly. What he's giving us is he's saying we can apply this to us. We don't have to say, well, John the Baptist, this was a very unique situation, and John, gave way to Jesus. But we could use this in our lives, and we can learn from this, that self-denial and humility that John showed. It may not be on the same scale, I think he says, that John had, but nevertheless we can play it out in our lives. So yeah, I think you got that.
Yeah, there was a great quote that I really enjoyed. If I can find it, he talks about arithmetic is the same whether it's done with millions or with pennies, or the math problem is the same. Here it is on page 281 of the 18 Upbuilding Discourses, the Hong edition. An arithmetic problem is the same whether it involves millions or pennies. So even if we didn't have the same sort of preordained task as John the Baptist to be the greatest man on earth or something like that, we still go through that same sort of problem of seeing ourselves decrease but increasing as the result of God increasing. I don't know. I guess that's kind of, is that it? I mean, is that it?
Yeah.
I mean, is there more to say? Is there more to say about the greatness of entering into self-denial, becoming the instrument of God's work, and then realizing that you're essentially a co-worker of God, and that there's some sort of greater feeling as a result of working in tandem with God? And I guess maybe, can we say anything about that qualitative nature of working, being God's hammer or being God's plow or whatever we are supposed to be, or being like what we're doing right here, being God's whatever we're being right now. I don't know if we're educators or whatever we are for God.
Yeah. No. Yes, I do. I think that it's a simple idea, but I don't think. I think Kierkegaard is giving us that simple idea, trying to get us to think about it in more depth. He saw this applied today, in that people don't really think this way anymore. Even in churches, I think people are seeing their ministry as the greatest thing for them. They don't want to let go of it. They're not ready to pass anything down to anybody. I want my name in lights. I want my celebrityness. I want my fame. And no thought is ever really given to passing that down to someone else who might be greater. In other words, a teacher really, in my way of thinking, really wants to see every student become greater than him or her. I mean, that's really the successful teacher who could make the student greater than himself. But I don't think we see that practice so much more today. And he says that kind of at the end. I think that's one of the reasons he writes this, because the world doesn't really provide any evidence that this is true anymore. People don't see themselves in a transitory state of handing their authority down to somebody else, their success to somebody else. Do you agree with that?
I certainly, I don't know. I mean, it depends on the circle that you run in. I don't think about it a lot. I don't necessarily think about, at least in this context, like, who my audience is or who my protege is or anything like that. Maybe I used to think about that in terms of music, but it's definitely not a theme that has been driven home to me in the traditional academic structure. And maybe that's a real big problem that we're hitting upon.
Well, one of the problems that I see is that people think, and they forget a very simple idea. If I were a pastor, or if I had a church, or if I had a church with 10,000 people in it, it's not my ministry, it's God's ministry. It's not about me becoming popular. It's not, I'm just transitory. As he says, we're messengers. And this is the message I have to offer. It's not about me. The message isn't about me. It's not about my success. It's about me always having this sense of being transitory, always having this sense that I am replaceable. And I think when we get into the next discourse, I think he makes this even more evident and more clear about our attitude towards ourselves. How do we deal with our own humility? We have to see ourselves in that temporary position, in that, I forgot what the other word he uses. Well, later on we talk about seeing ourselves as nothing compared to, God. But that's for next week. But I think that's where he's going with this, in that direction. He wants us to see we should be humble and ready to give it to someone else. Whether there's somebody there or not, we have to always be ready to relinquish it. It's not ours. It's just we're the messenger of the day. And God's called us to deliver that message. That's how I see what he's getting at.
Well, there's this weird tension, right? Because we're in this discourse, we're to be turned into instruments, right? Or practice some sort of self-denial to be that messenger for God. But at the same time, there's this sort of rejoicing greatness to the whole act, right? And is that just sort of like that we feel eternally validated because we are in communion with God? So even in the fact that we are individually annihilated, we have decreased in a greater sense, that superficial individuality gives way to a much more enlightening feeling. Is that how you understand it? There's it's this weird thing where there's annihilation and greatness bound up together, where there's nothingness and culmination occurring simultaneously. It just depends on your perspective.
Yeah. What I see happening is, and maybe there is a dynamic of both, but I see a little bit differently. I see being able to rejoice because someone else is able to go beyond where you're at. See, John the Baptist became famous, it said, because he was able to bow out. He was able to be joyful that there was someone to take his ministry from him and take it to the finish line, so to speak. And that's the attitude we should have. It's not so much that we should look at our own humility and bathe in it and say, I'm so happy that I'm humble and I'm so joyful that I'm such a humble guy, I'm willing to give over my ministry. But rather that I'm happy for this new person who's taking it over. I actually have legitimate joy, not jealousy. I think that's what he's getting at here. Because I think it would be maybe our first instinct to say, I built this whole thing up, and I built this from nothing, and this is my ministry, and now I'm going to give it to this young guy. I'm jealous. This is mine. Well, whereas he's saying, I'm glad I'm able to give it to somebody else, and I'm joyful for them that they have this ministry now.
And that's the thing that that's the thing that there's ambiguity in this text that is troubling me just a little bit, is that who is this he must I must decrease so he can increase situation? Like if we just look at the John the Baptizer scenario, like that's a very particular scenario where like John's mission comes to a close as Jesus's opens up, right? But like the way that I read that particular Bible passage is like, no, I personally, Luke Johnson, has to decrease. Like I have to stop taking myself so seriously and making it all about me.
Yeah.
And continue to usher in sort of Jesus's word, right?
Yeah.
That his dominion can increase. Or am I supposed to be thinking about it more in terms of like, no, I must decrease so that whoever comes after me, like whoever is my co-pilot or whoever my protege or whatever that's driving this noetic mechanism, I have to prepare the way for them. It seems like it's because the reason why this is hard to understand is that Kierkegaard even says at the end that this notion is available to pagans, and he's not necessarily talking about Christ in particular. He says on page 289, he must increase. Who is the he? In the sense in which we have used the word, everyone can identify him with another name. This is how change occurs here on earth. One increases and another decreases. And today it is I and tomorrow you. But one who in humble self-denial and with genuine joy saw another increase, his mind will be turned into a new joy, and this new joy of his will surely be full. Maybe it's a synthesis of the two. Maybe if we combine these two views of there being a distinct person that whether it be like if I have a son one day or a protege or something like that, if I can reign in my own life and sort of pass on some things like that, but then at the same time use that person, I don't want to say use, but employ that person to continue on with the general sort of message that we're talking about here. Is that what we're talking about?
I think so. But it doesn't always have to be somebody there. I think that he's giving us an attitude towards what we have. And I use the term ministry, you can, might use another term if you want, but I see it in that sense. There may not be somebody out there, a student or a protege, like you say, somebody that that you physically can see and say, okay, this is who I'm preparing. But I think it's an attitude that we have about who we are and our importance.
Right.
That we think that it's just transitory. Our importance is transitory. Another could come along after us, maybe even after we're dead. And like with Kierkegaard, he wasn't even famous when he was alive.
Yeah.
But yet he must have had this attitude that somebody's going to call. That's why I'm writing all this stuff for you, Luke, so you can read all my works and take over. Right? So he might not know you were going to be here, but he's got all this stuff ready.
And
right?
maybe 1,200 years from now, someone will take some inspiration from our videos and the protege will emerge then. I'll never know them.
That's right. So I think that we don't necessarily have to have anybody in mind, but we have to have the concept in mind in order to prepare us. What do you think about that? Do you think that covers it?
I think so. I mean, I think in the concept, but I mean, are you willing to attach? And I'm not sure because Kierkegaard, because like I said, I did find this to be kind of a stylistically and maybe philosophically clumsier discourse of his. I'm usually not that critical of Kierkegaard. I usually give him like 5 out of 5 stars.
Oh yeah.
I just he never really comes out and says directly, like, hey, you got to get over yourself so like Jesus can like be 900 feet tall and be the focus of everything. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think he could have said this in a smaller, how could I say it, in fewer words. I think he kind of rambled a little bit, is what I would say. I think he rambled on this issue. I think he could have said it a whole lot more concisely, but that's not how he works. So
he can be forgiven, given he's.
We'll forgive him for rambling a little bit. But I think next week he rambles even more. So, but this week he's rambled a little bit.
So if we were to close it, and I still have questions about John the Baptizer, by the way, because I'm looking.
Well, we'll try to answer it.
Yeah, but just to close out this discourse, I mean, and we revisit why it is that universally everyone says that a sunrise is better than a sunset. What I take away from all of this is that the commitment to self-denial and seeing someone see someone else increase, and I'm taking that someone else to necessarily to be Jesus, and then maybe that gets passed on down the line or whatever. The reason why we like to see people supplant us and take the place by promulgating this particular worldview is that we feel like we're doing God's work in coordination with him. Is that essentially what it is? That like we're okay with the falling away of ourselves. Like I don't care. Like I don't know when I'm gonna die. I could die at any moment, and for some reason I'm remarkably okay with that. I don't know why.
Yeah.
But because I kind of feel like maybe I've participated in this promulgation of the gospel and of ideas and whatever this mission God has set up for me.
Exactly. The mission has become more important than Bob, and the mission has become more important than Luke, and the mission was more important than John the Baptist. So yes, I agree with you. And I have a conclusion too that's just parallel to yours. So it says, his quotation said, so one increases and another decreases. Everyone would rather see the rising sun than the setting sun. Why everyone, do you suppose? So both the one upon whom the sun is rising and upon whom it is setting must rejoice. It may be setting on me, but I'm rejoicing not at my setting on me. I'm rejoicing at the rising of the sun on you. Do you see? So everybody is rejoicing at the rising of the sun. It's just that it's not my rising, it's someone else's. So that's kind of how we have to get over ourselves and focus. It's rising on somebody else, and I'm perfectly fine with that. I find joy in that, like you said, that I am able to give to somebody something that will be of value, and I'll take joy in that it's going to rise on that person now.
Well, and hopefully I can pass the torch as well. I think the only other thing, I mean, the interesting thing, and we alluded to it earlier, and not to get too hung up, I know we've probably got more into the details, which I love, talking about John the Baptizer's status and stuff like that. We might want to say, just dwell a little bit longer on this thing from page 287. He talks about John the Baptizer being the bridegroom's friend. And on page 287, but the least one in the kingdom of heaven is greater than John, because he does not stand outside listening to the bridegroom's voice. I guess something I was kind of curious is if, because John the Baptizer was still kind of living under the law, like you said earlier, if what do we experience that's qualitatively different from what John the Baptizer experiences by knowing the resurrection, by knowing Christ subjectively? And I guess kind of, is John the Baptizer kind of in, I know there's this whole talk about where did Christ go during those 3 days in between the crucifixion and the resurrection? And he went to the breast of Abraham, and there were the old prophets there. Would John the Baptizer have been kind of in that same group? Would he have been in this kind of limbo situation? I
don't know if I can answer that one. That's a hard one because nobody really knows what life after death is like specifically. That's one of the things we hope for and we have faith in. But I can speak to the parable of the bridegroom. The bridegroom and the bride was used, I guess, substantially in the New Testament by some of the writers. It showed the bridegroom, of course, have an intimate relationship. The friend of the bridegroom, he's happy for the bridegroom.
He's like the best man.
This is my friend. He's getting married. I'm really happy for him. And he's going to be married. But I can't be part of that. That relationship between my friend and his wife, that's unique, that's special. I can't be part of that as his friend. See? So now what does that mean? Well, we have to understand that the bride was kind of symbolic of the new believer, the church, we might say. So Christ is married to the church. He's married to the new believer. John wasn't able to be in that same relationship because, again, he hadn't yet seen the Christ come into his kingdom. He was right up to that point. He could hear his friend, the bridegroom, and he knew he was going to get married, and he's saying, hey, great for you, I'm all for this, I'm so happy for you, but he never got to be part of that relationship. So that's where John kind of, what you might say, he was not permitted in because the event hadn't yet taken place, but he's certainly permitted in now.
Yes.
The understanding is everybody from the Old Testament who died once the kingdom came about are ushered into the new kingdom now. So John is there now. He's not waiting someplace else. I would expect they're all in the same spiritual place.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting. Sorry, there's a little echo. It's interesting to think about John as the best man in this wedding ceremony.
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
Because as someone who just went to a wedding, right, there's happiness for your friend, but at the same time, there's sort of like a little bit of sadness that it doesn't ultimately culminate with your own joy. And we can see why being a believer has a further concentration of joy and celebration to it in this analogy, because you're sort of being united with your soulmate, right? Whereas as a best friend, you're always happy to see these sort of unifications happy to occur. But if you're not yourself participating in it, there's kind of a ceiling to how much happiness you can actually experience when you're at that wedding party.
Yeah. See, John. For John, he, again, being under the law, his forgiveness came through the rituals, through the offerings of the sacrifices. But our forgiveness comes through that relationship with Christ, through our faith in Christ. So he was not able to partake of that same thing. He still had to live under the law because that's what was required of him. Not bad, it's just what was required of him. He couldn't transition to that new element of faith only and grace because it hadn't yet fully been, hadn't yet been fulfilled.
And maybe just to be a little bit more explicit about it, the reason why our situation might be better than John the Baptizer's is that if we are in the relationship with Christ and we do have faith, at least in those moments where we can overcome ourselves and unite with Christ, there can be forgiveness of sin.
Right.
Whereas John, living underneath the law, I don't know if he ever qualitatively experienced the escape from sin, despite all the rituals and whatever he would do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Otherwise, if he could, then Christ would be superfluous. You would, if that's the whole point, right? Like Christ comes from our salvation to get us out from sin, and
Right.
the law couldn't do that. Would that be a right way to frame it?
Yeah, the way the theologians would express it, and the way Paul expressed it, well, in Hebrews it expresses it that the sacrifices went on continually. There had to be a sacrifice, every year, every so often, every Saturday they had to make an offering for the forgiveness of sin. But with Christ, we have one offering on the cross that's for eternity. So John was not part of that phase of the sacrifices. So John was forgiven. John must have experienced a certain amount of forgiveness, but it just had to be renewed each week.
In a certain way, we have to continue to make sacrifices too, right? And that's what this whole self-denial thing is about, right? Like we have to continually sacrifice our temporal lives for the sake of God's glory, for the sake of Christ, right?
Yeah, the way Paul says it, he said, you have to offer yourselves as a living sacrifice. But it's a continual one. It's not like discrete ones. Okay, it's Sunday. I'm going to make a sacrifice this Sunday because it's church day. And then next week I'll wait, I'll have do all my sinning during the week. And next week I have to do the sacrifice again. So it's not like discrete moments in time that we make our sacrifice. We have to do it once for all. It has to be a continual sacrifice where we offer ourselves continually as a living sacrifice. So it's a little bit different, but I think you're on track. It's
a repetition, right? Which is another book of Soren Kierkegaard's where I think he explores this idea.
Yeah.
So, yeah, maybe we've belabored the point here, and maybe everybody totally understands, but yeah, it seems like that self-denial is the sacrifice of kind of the aesthetic pleasures for our commitment to Christ. And even though there's sort of an annihilation of our personal wants, riches, fame, whatever else, we grow internally in a way that's even superior to what John the Baptizer experienced, because we know about the liberation from sin in the relationship to Christ as his greatness grows, and as we diminish in the world but grow stronger in him.
Yeah, let me point something out, because I think you said something that's really something I really would like to comment on that's worthwhile. A lot of times we see sin as something that we have to give up, and it's almost like we're doing it reluctantly. In order to get salvation, I have to give up those things I really like to do. Sin. But really, according to the way Jesus preached it, like we have the parable of the pearl of great price, when you find a pearl, really the one you're looking for, you sell everything else you have to own that pearl. And he gives us other, the buried treasure. And all these parables is really about finding something you really want above everything else. So for me, I want Christ above everything else. So for me, giving up sin isn't like, oh, I got to give it up. It's like, no, I found something better than sin.
Yeah.
And that idea just isn't preached enough. That it's not so much giving something up as it is taking something better, grasping something better. So if I was a preacher, that's what I would be preaching about. So thanks for the 2 minutes of preaching here. I was a preacher for 2 minutes.
No. Well, I mean, I think we covered a lot of it. Kierkegaard probably would have thought I dwelled too much on the historical facticity of John the Baptizer, but I don't know. I feel like I learned a ton from you today, Robert. I don't know. Is there anything else you'd like to say in closing?
No, thank you very much for the opportunity to do this. I really do. I don't always say that, but thanks.
So I guess we're done with the 3 Upbuilding Discourses, and I guess are there 4 left? Is that what we have?
Yeah, the next package is in 4.
Okay.
I think that's about it, isn't it? But the next one is a little longer than this one, but I think he does a lot of repeating, so I think hopefully we can condense it still to about the same amount of time.
Yeah, cool. All right, well, I will get this uploaded to the Noetic app, which everyone should download for their iPhone and Android devices. And yeah, we'll be back next week. Woo, that's some nice music. That's a good ending. All right, take care, Robert.
Okay.
Bye.